Well, as you can see on the screen this evening, we're drawing to a close on our topics for liturgy. We've been doing this since last September, I think, and I think we're almost up to 30 sessions altogether on different topics. So as we draw to a close, we've got another couple of topics to do. We're going to do liturgy and language, which for us is very important, being a French-speaking sort of bilingual church with some German thrown in, and some Dutch, as we shall see this weekend, and the new translations and everything. It's an important part of who we are and what we do at Saint-Esprit. I also am aware that one of the most important things that we still have to do is liturgy and music, which is quite a project. It's a big one. So we're going to see if we can get Cynthia to help us, give us a hand with that a little bit too. But as we're coming to a close, we're going to look a little bit at liturgy at Saint-Esprit and see how that's developed over the years and how it sort of fits in some ways with what we've been studying over the last little while. So I'm going to use some material that I used several years ago with some members of the church for the Huguenot bike tour through New York City, exploring some of the sites that we had worshipped in the city since 1628. And what we did in those sites was to use a piece of the liturgy that they would have used last on that particular site. So it gave us a good idea of how the liturgy had developed and changed over the years at Saint-Esprit as the congregation changed in terms of its size and its social influence and the waves of refugees who came, and also in terms of its location, where the church was in the past. Then we're going to have a little look at liturgy at Saint-Esprit for the last 25 years since I arrived, and see how we have changed the liturgy at Saint-Esprit, including and up to what the pandemic has done to our liturgy. So here we go. Our first site was way downtown at a grist mill. It wasn't a church at all. It was a horse mill, a horse dragged round a millstone, which you can still see apparently at the First Presbyterian Church. And it was between South William Street and Stone Street, right at the bottom of town. And the liturgies in those days, and I'm sure Joris can fill us in a little bit on this, were not at all like the liturgies that we have today. The pastor, as we will see in a few moments, very often wrote their own morning prayer that followed a particular order, which we will see in a minute or two, and people prayed and sang from the Genevan Psalter. This is taken from the Church's Geneva Bible, which was published a little later than our foundation in 1657. As you can see, it's the 23rd Psalm. Mon Dieu me paie sur sa puissance haute. Everybody would have sung this together. They would have known the tune very well. And the music was a crucial part of those early meetings. And it must have reminded them of the songs that they'd sung back home in France or in the Low Countries or in England or wherever they'd come from as refugees. They all would have been singing the same song. And as they came together, music for them was a crucial way of finding their common identity in a new worship space, even if it was in a grist mill upstairs in right here, basically, near Harry's Takeout and Delivery. Here's South William Street, I believe, and here's the canal you can see, and it was down on Mill Street. It's one of the shortest streets in New York City, and the grist mill was probably somewhere in this area here, where this sort of odd half-timbered looking building is. Did you want to add anything about very early Huguenot worship, Joris?
Yeah, so they would use, they would follow the rules basically and the traditions of the Reformed Church. That is the way the Reformed Church worshipped. And the Huguenots in New York City, when it was still a Dutch colony, were part of the Dutch Reformed Church, but they had their little organization inside it, kind of a different. The equivalent for us would be kind of like a different diocese inside the church, or little classes, a little group of churches. In New York City, at the very beginning, there were not so many. They couldn't organize as a congregation as early as they could. They held some services in French, but they were not always like a separate congregation. But the church, the Reformed Church in France, was really renowned in amongst the Reformed world. That some thought that it was the most pure part of the Reformed Church, and they also suffered a lot of persecution. And for a lot of the people who were part of the Reformed Church in France and who had to leave France and their communities, they really clung to the Psalter and the Genevan Psalter, which was the Psalter used throughout the Francophone world at that time, and really became something, some form of an identity to these people, because they left, and a bit exactly actually like the Hebrews, when they were sent into exile, their texts became the place where they would find a form of continuity, a form of liaison, of continual relation to their homeland. So when they sing some psalms that are about exile in their native language, in this language that people used both in France and abroad in the refuge, it was really meaningful because it was really connecting them throughout the world and Western Europe and South Africa to where people would worship in French.
I find it quite touching that we still sing these songs today to the same tunes and more or less the same words. It's a 400-year continuity at Saint-Esprit. So yes, our liturgy has evolved and changed, but it has deep, deep roots in the past, and we've always celebrated where we're from because we're still from there. Some of those psalms that speak of exile and persecution and coming together in a new place really speak to us in our liturgies today. It's important. We then moved to a new church in 1687. You'll notice we weren't there for that long. In the 1680s, Louis XIV revoked the Edict of Nantes. And this meant that a huge number of new refugees arrived from France. And they could no longer be accommodated in either the little grist mill or the church in the fort, the Dutch church in the fort that the French church worshipped in for a little while. Here you can see that this is a prayer of the persecuted Huguenot. It was passed hand to hand by prisoners on the galley La Superbe, one of those places where people were sent as galley slaves under Louis XIV. This is the church where Elinot's wife, that should read Elinot, not Louis Roux. Elinot's wife worshipped here before she was reunited with her husband after he was a prisoner on the galleys and in the Chateau d'If. It's quite a moving prayer that we very often print in the bulletins for Huguenot Sunday and still pray it today. Here is the location of that little church on what is today called Marketfield Street. It used to be called Petticoat Lane. It's quite close to the seafront, the harbour front. And Petticoat Lane got its name probably from an obvious source. It was the street where the les dames de petite vertu would gather and show their petticoats to attract the sailors who were coming in. But the French church got their little spot there and constructed a church of their own right here. Here's Bowling Green, where the tube stop is today. and you can wander down. It's at the end of a little blocked off alley now. It's quite hard to get to. I remember Linnea went to great trouble getting us permission to go into this private little corner where there's a monument to Saint-Esprit's first church in metal on the wall, in order for us to pray that prayer in that very spot for the first time, I think, since the church had moved from there in 1704. The church probably looked something like this. And we can see that it's quite a small church. It's not, this is the width of a couple of houses here, perhaps, sort of maybe slightly bigger than the church that we've got just now, but not much bigger. It proved very soon to be too small for the congregation that was arriving in great numbers. More people spoke French in New York City than spoke Dutch at a certain point, and certainly than spoke English. This was about the time when Trinity Wall Street was founded towards the end of the 1600s. Apparently, we have a lovely record of a sum of money paid to a widow who whitewashed the exterior of the church for us, climbing up ladders with buckets of whitewash. Apparently, it was quite a thing at the time. The church then moved again and stayed in its new location for quite a long time. I think it's the longest time the French church has stayed anywhere. You can see it's about 120, 130 years, almost, at Le Temple du Saint-Esprit, called that way because this was the place where we became an Episcopal church. And I'll talk about the impact that had on our liturgy in a minute. It was at the corner of Pine and Nassau Streets, at the back of the Federal Reserve Building. You'll see a picture of that in a minute. Now, Louis Roux was the minister of this church from 1710 until about 1750. And he wrote this little invocation, this Prière du Matin, faite en 1704, when he was a student over in Leyden. And he read it out several times. They would go back to these little morning prayers that they'd written and constructed very, very carefully to be read out at the opening of the service. You'll see that they follow a liturgical form, even though it might sound extempore, even though it's a reformed business and it's not a book of common prayer. These carefully written prayers were read out several times. People would have several copies that they would do for different occasions. And here you can see that his handwritten copy here on the left-hand side, which is in the New York Public Library, I transcribed it and translated it into English. Let's see if we can follow something of the liturgical construction of this little prayer. Look at what they're doing at the very beginning of the service. It follows a logical order. Lord our God, creator of heaven and earth, it's acknowledging who is there and what we're doing. We, thy humble servants, and the work of thy hands, whom thou hast fashioned in thine own image, and whom thou dost preserve in all our days by the wondrous providence, whom thou hast filled with thy most precious grace. See, it's giving thanks, almost like the opening of the Eucharistic prayer, recognizing that we were created in God's image. So there's a sort of reflection here of that sort of piety. But look what happens next. We humble ourselves before thy throne to adore thy greatness, holy, 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 and to pay the homage that we owe. You can see it's still following something like a Eucharistic form. O Lord our God, how great thou art, how majestic thy name in all the earth. The heavens tell out your glory. You've brought perfect praise out of the mouth of babes and sucklings. But suddenly it turns to saying, we are not worthy to praise you. That's where this ... business is, which we missed out of our prayer when we were downtown. Saying we're not worthy, we come to you to confess our sins and our unworthiness. We're fallen creatures and we deserve punishment. Once again, an echo of the Eucharistic prayer. where it says, you made us in your own image, but when we fell and became subject to sin and death, you in your great mercy sent to us Jesus Christ, your only begotten Son, to live and die among us. So this is that little section here, acknowledging our sinfulness. We tend to think of it as reformed, but actually we do it in our Eucharistic prayer too. Grant us the grace of your Holy Spirit, without which we cannot be worthy of you. It's almost an epiclesis here, calling down the Holy Spirit on the congregation. May your Spirit renew us, sanctify us, and purify us. May we become a new creation, just, holy, and irreprehensible before your eyes, and perfect even as our Father in heaven is perfect. So we're relying on the grace of God at the beginning of this liturgy to come down on the people, to offer worthy praise, to sing, to listen, to hear the sermon in the right sort of spirit. So these opening prayers of the Reformed Church of the time could be very beautifully written and very carefully written here, and would be used as a sort of go-to text at the opening of the liturgy. Anything to add, Joris, on that?
No, I think it's really interesting, this prayer too, because and you cut off some bits when you did that, but you see that also it's really insisting on God the Father and a very Calvinist conception of God, who is above and like the creator, the God that's beyond and also the master of all the creation. His greatness is called and talked about and described, but you don't have much Jesus for what we have.
No, that's right. Yes, it seems like that's missing a little bit. Yeah. Anyway, we prayed that prayer down at. This is a picture of the church as it was then. It used to be called l'Église Languedocienne. Languedocienne, because apparently it looked like a little church in the Languedoc. So we had a bell tower. The bell is now in New Rochelle. Here's the entrance to the church, quite traditional, and here is probably the sacristy of the church, this little octagonal building that's sticking out on one side. Here's another image of it with perhaps Louis Roux going in there to do a little scribbling. You can see there was a graveyard attached to the church, so funerals would have taken place here, funerals and baptisms. Communion would be only 4 times a year. The sermons survive that were preached in this particular church that have a very reformed quality to them very often. They don't refer very much to the events of the day, apart from the slave rebellion, which is referred to, which he blames on giving the slaves alcohol to drink. Just around the corner from Saint-Esprit. This is the site today. The church would have stood here at the back of the Federal Building, right here. Here's Wall Street, the great financial centre. It was from this church when George Washington was sworn in on his Masonic swearing in as president. We were the closest church to the Federal Building. And so his Masonic oath, apparently, liturgically speaking, was sworn on the Bible of Saint-Esprit from the time. It's an interesting, rather spooky connection with the past. That those of you who were there on the Tour Huguenot will remember standing around here and reciting that morning prayer and leaving a little bouquet right here as we were eyed suspiciously by the security guards. We had no idea of what we were doing. It was rather moving to recreate their liturgies and to hear the French words read out or sung. Actually, we sang a couple of times in places where those songs had not echoed for hundreds of years. It was a moving expedition. Now, we became an Episcopal church back here in this little building here in 1803, and we had some rather fancy silver made at that particular point. You can see this here on the flagon that we still use on big occasions. On the right, you can see the seal of the church, and you can see the date 1689. This date, 1689, was the time when we built our first church and organised our first governing body. That's not the date of the first liturgy in French in Manhattan. That date is 1628. But as we've just seen, we were with the Dutch in the mill and in the fort. And then in 1689, we built our own church. So here you can see the cachet de l'Église Française de la Nouvelle-York, with the tetragrammaton over the top of it, and the wonderful motto of the church, the one who transported you will give you strength. However, what we're looking at here, most interestingly, I just took these photos so you can see I'm wearing the same jersey. On the left-hand side here, you can see something rather significant. Can you see, underneath, there's a book that says Liturgy. It's the Book of Common Prayer.
It's not even called Book of Common Prayer.
It's not even called the Book of Common Prayer. It's just called Liturgy. As if to say this is a slightly suspect thing that they've not used before, even though, as we just saw, the prayers that they actually read out were repeated, and the form of the service had a sort of liturgical structure to it. We've seen this time and time again, and we can see it in our own history. Liturgy is a human instinct. It's not a technical invention. It's something that we do because we're liturgical creatures. So their understanding of it, a sort of reformed understanding, perhaps in the Huguenot silversmith that made this, it's almost as if he's saying, your liturgy's all very well, your Book of Common Prayer. Now we've become an Episcopal church, but you can't beat the Bible. And there is the Bible thundering down on the top of the liturgy. The Bible is open and the liturgy is closed. And it says, La Sainte Bible, with the Holy Spirit hovering over it. It's almost as if this is the impact of this ray of explosive ray around about it. Looks like the impact of the Bible on the liturgy.
I wonder if you can have also another reading of it and see that, like, the liturgy is the prop that holds the Bible, and it's also it's holding it so that you can read it too.
Yes, that's true. And you know, one of the things that perhaps you've all noticed as we've done morning and evening prayer particularly and recited all of the Psalms, the content of the liturgy is drawn directly from the Bible. It's not like it's been invented somehow. Even the collects evoke passages in the Psalms and in the Hebrew scriptures, and certainly in the New Testament too. So I think that's a good reading of it.
I think it's quite if you look at it, it's quite of an Orthodox Christian statement in a sense, because the liturgy derives, as you say, Nigel, from the Bible itself. That it's set on the other one, but it also the light comes out of both of them.
Yes, that's true.
So it's in the relationship.
Down at the bottom.
It's the relationship that's important, I think, and that's kind of emphasized that with the superiority of the Word of God in the canon of the Bible.
Yes. I think that's one of the rather nice things about the specific liturgies of Saint-Esprit, that we've always been conscious and aware of our Reformed roots in a way that sometimes the Episcopal Church or the Anglican Church can come adrift from, even though it might call itself Protestant. It's rather cautious about using those words when it comes to the liturgy. But I think our deep roots there make us really aware of the Bible and the contents of the Bible. Far more so, I dare bet, than some people who may have joined us from the Roman Catholic tradition, who might not be aware of the contents of the Bible in quite the same way. So when we use the liturgy, we hear those echoes because we're so familiar with the Bible, or in theory we are. Maybe.
What I find interesting too is that the book of the liturgy is closed, but the book of the Bible is open. So you can say, yes, it's like you're not reading it, but in the end, that's what the liturgy is and for. And when you really live it, you don't even need to open it.
Yes, that's true, I suppose.
So there's something about it, about the mystery of liturgy with this closed book. I think that's quite interesting too.
It's quite touching. Yeah. It's interesting that it's on the flagon for communion or baptism.
Yes, too. Yeah.
So I sometimes put the water for baptism in here too. That's not just specifically used for one purpose. Mm-hmm. We then move to our swankiest location, I have to say, and the fanciest church we've ever worshipped in, I think. From 1831 to 1862, we were at the corner of Church and Franklin Streets. And this is a photograph of the altar copy of the Book of Common Prayer, the Rite for Morning Prayer, in fact, used in the church. It was translated specifically for Saint-Esprit by the first minister of the newly formed Episcopal French Church of Saint-Esprit, printed in 1803. So it was used in the former church, in that the church with the nice tower to it, and in the church we're about to see a picture of. It was a sort of classically printed book, and it sort of suited the classical style of the new church, as we can see. So the title page at the front of this book that we still have in the archives, it says "Pour l'usage de l'Église protestante française de Saint-Esprit à la Nouvelle-York", imprimé à la Nouvelle-York de l'imprimerie de Robert Wilson, 1803. So you can see it was made very specifically. But if you look across here, we have here the end of the Creed. If you've been following our morning prayers, you know that at the end of the Creed, we come into a few responses here. Le Seigneur soit avec vous et avec ton esprit. Prie en Dieu, it says. Ô Seigneur, fais luire sur nous ta miséricorde et nous accorde ton salut. Ô Dieu, crée en nous des cœurs purs et ne nous ôte point l'esprit de ta sainteté. Then comes the collect of the day, unless it's a Holy Communion service. And then you've got these collects that we still say, the collect for peace and the collect for grace. Seigneur notre Père Céleste, Dieu éternel et tout-puissant. Did you want to read that?
Which one?
This one here. Who has brought us safely to the beginning of this day.
Seigneur notre Père Céleste, Dieu éternel et tout-puissant, qui nous a fait arriver heureusement au commencement de ce jour, conserve-nous pendant sa durée par ta puissance, et nous fais la grâce qu'aujourd'hui nous ne tombions dans aucun péché et que nous ne courions aucun danger, mais dirige et conduis.
Oui. It got cut off.
It's interesting because when you read it, because it's a bit of a dated French, you would stumble.
Yes. Yeah.
And a bit like we stumble with the new translation.
With the new translation, that's right. Yeah, that we're struggling with at the moment. Yeah. Contre tous les assauts de nos ennemis. Ouais. La puissance d'aucun adversaire. Rather different from the current translation that we have of the Book of Common Prayer. But you can see this tradition goes back over 200 years at Saint-Esprit of morning prayer according to the Episcopal rite. Here's a picture of that church from the outside and from the inn. It was written up in various fancy magazines. You can see it's in a classical style there with the dome and the Doric columns. At the front of it, it looks like something from the City of London, from roughly the same sort of period. Here you can see the aisles and the pews inside with these clean glass windows. I'm finding it difficult to see what's at the front here. I suspect it's an altar, but with a pulpit perhaps behind it. What do you think, Joris? Because this was before the Oxford movement.
You think it's a two-decked?
I think it could be a two-decked thing. Yeah.
A two-decked pulpit. The style looks really interesting. That would be interesting to know more also about who commanded it, like who... Because it also looks quite similar to a Freemason temple.
It does rather.
Yeah.
Yes.
And when we know the connections of Saint-Esprit with this,
with Freemasonry.
Freemasonry.
Yes, absolutely. That was always an important
Doric,
part of it.
the Doric
Yes.
chapiteau.
Yes,
chapters.
here.
Yeah.
It's the curly Doric things, the wonderful pediment. It was right next to the Opera House, this church. And the Opera House, it wasn't like today, you know, where they paid very expert international opera singers. It was mostly Italian barbers who spent the week cutting people's hair and got together to sing in the Opera House in the evening. But they hadn't been paid, so they set fire to the Opera House in true mafia style. And unfortunately, the flames caught hold of the dome and burned the dome down. So the later pictures of this church show it without the dome.
The dome is a very interesting piece of architecture, though, because it's reproducing the Pantheon in Rome.
Yes, yes.
It's exactly with the oculus in the middle, where the
middle.
lantern was. So it also gives an idea of the references they're using to build the church, which are Greco-Roman.
Yes.
Well, close to Freemasonry, I think, on a lot of levels.
It was terribly fashionable,
Yeah.
apparently. The sermons were written up in the local newspapers. It was a rather glamorous minister who was there at the time. People would arrive in their finery, in their carriages, coming up to the church. Their clothes were described even in the newspaper. It was a fashionable place to attend a liturgy. There was probably a good choir as well, and rather good acoustics here with this dome and this open space inside. But I don't see a pulpit either side here, which is what makes me think that the pulpit is implicated somehow under this apse at the far end. Yes, it's still a fashionable place to be, even during COVID. We then moved again to the fifth site on 30 West 22nd Street, from where we were from 1862 to 1900, so about 40 years or so. Now, the most important liturgical events to take place in this church was a service for the founding of the Huguenot Society of America, by John Jay, the great crusader against slavery, and the celebration of the 300th anniversary of the Edict of Nantes, which took place in this church as well, by King Henry IV. Sorry, that should read rather than King Henry I. Now, this photo, it shows a copy of the admission ticket for the church to that great big liturgical celebration. So you can see, here we go, Thursday, April the 14th, the anniversary of the promulgation of the Edict of Nantes. It's a 2-day event, this liturgy. And it says, at a meeting of the stewards on March the 24th, who these stewards were, we're quite sure, immediately preceding the executive committee meeting, Mrs. Lawton reported the money spent and the contracts pending approval. As the London Society would not allow the travelling expenses of their delegates to be met by our society, Mrs. Lawton engaged to pay for the music by the choristers for 50 of the souvenirs, obviously were handed out at the time, and any other extras which might, by the stewards, be regarded as luxuries. She reported that the French white flag with the 21 fleurs de lis embroidered would cost $150, and an American banner of the same size with the stars embroidered would cost $50, and the amount needed would therefore be $200 subscribed by these terribly fashionable people at the end of the thing, including Colonel William J. You can see some famous names, Bowden there. You can see Jacob de Peyster, the descendant of the original settlers of New York, and various other rather powerful figures in New York City at the time. There was a poem to be read during this service which will give you some sort of idea of the sort of liturgies that were taking place in the church, the formality of them, the rather empire grandeur that you've got. Un nouveau Constantin rassemble ses sujets. C'est un père, un ami. It's a hymn to Henri IV, basically. Henri IV, en ce jour, promet la tolérance chez les proscrits d'hier, l'espoir né et grandi. So you've got this whole thing coming through. Here is a little translation of it. A new Constantine is gathering his subjects together. There you go. Time can never blow out the ancestral flame. It's a rather different way of looking at the past than we might have when we look back in our liturgies today. We would deal with it very differently. It's lit anew by faith in our hearts. Its latent power is the divine law which allows progress, capital P, to light our paths through doubt. You who read this story, remember this page that it might be read anew. May the Holy Child who reads it find in it a gift from God to pass on to generations yet to come. Progress, liberty, the gift of Europe to the world. We can see that perhaps we would tell that story liturgically rather differently now. We may still be proud of that. We may still, as we will this coming Sunday, remember with affection and love those who went through so much persecution to get to this sort of point where they could write in a world where toleration could be taken for granted, a paean of praise for the fact that that had been granted to them, and a great celebration of that 300th anniversary of that promulgation as part of the liturgical history of Saint-Esprit. How do we read that liturgically now?
It's very interesting also because this hymn really calls for kind of like the continuation, ce flambeau des aïeux qu'aucun temps ne consume. It's very in like the nationalist mindset of the time. It looks very much like, well, the American anthem, the French, the Marseillaise too. You see, and that's the moment also when the church is really invaded, I want to say, by this form of rationalism and kind of the conjunction of progress and faith are seen in one go, but there's not much Christ either.
No, there isn't.
In this hymn, as you can tell. So it's a very good example of like imperial piety, I think, that we have also inherited in all the churches and Episcopal Church and everywhere, I think. But that's a very interesting poem to that extent.
And how that was woven into the understanding of all the liturgies, perhaps, that it was a
It's interesting because it's a liturgy also of transmission. We're talking about the aïeux, this idea that it's creating a story of the Huguenot ancestors that might not be our stories today at Saint-Esprit really. For everybody. We relate to this heritage not through this idea of, blood heritage, as it is in this text. You see le flambeau de nos aïeux, qu'aucun temps ne consume, but something we partake in it, a bit like we partake in Christ, maybe, through adoption or through different ways, not only through this almost biological transmission. And that's present in this text, or like bloodline that's present in this text.
It's funny also when you look at this verse here, to understand joy you have to go through the tears and pains and torments to get what you deserve, sort of. Whereas nowadays I think if we wove such an idea into our liturgies, that there would be more of a sort of confessional nature to it, if you get my drift. A solidarity with those who still suffer, a solidarity with those who are still arriving and coming through persecution, those whom we pray for at Elizabeth Detention Centre, and others of our congregation, dearly beloved members of our congregation, who have come from modern day persecution. These pains and torments and things and the suffering perhaps would be sung about rather differently, or owned in a different way because of the intervening century.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's really representative of the global mindset of the time and the era of revolutions. I think this idea that we are reverting things so it doesn't exist anymore. Any revolution of the time, it's really the mindset of the time that you can see here, because the suffering is in the past in this hymn.
Yes, it is.
It's not present.
Can't remember. To understand joy, we must remember the tears, the pains, the torments. We must shudder at the wind that blew over the smoking brands, to see in the morning dew an agent of deliverance. Yes. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? The suffering is in the past now, it's not...
I mean, we're also looking at one hymn.
Yes, so that's true. Yes, that's probably a little unfair. Yeah. There was that church as it stood on 22nd Street where these things happened. And there on the right you can see I'm putting up the little bouquet at the building that replaced it, and there's Leia underneath there. So it was a rather fun day, a fun trip.
Very Gothic style.
Yes, it is, isn't it? That wonderful steeple. The organ still exists from this church. It's in some sort of website. I've never seen it, and I'm not sure where it's ended up. But you can do some research on Saint-Esprit's organ and see what happened to it. Long ago demolished and replaced with a different building.
But from this church we've inherited the furniture, right?
Yes, and of course to think that some of our archives were there, the silver was there, the prayer books were there. It's rather touching to look at these pictures and see where they've all come from. Being dragged around, and either in horse and cart or in an old car or something, moving from place to place as God's people wandered in 10 liturgical locations since the foundation. We must be the most travelled church in New York City, I think. That's what it looks like now, right there. It's all very fancy. Then we moved again, just a few blocks. We were there for about 26 years, as you can see, from 1900 to 1926, 45 to 57 East 27th Street. Now, we've still got the hymnal that was used at that particular location. It's a small, flimsy thing where the hymns appear in other books that we've been using. And we sang this in the bank that is on the current site of it, and left a little bouquet of red, white and blue flowers on the ATM machine. But it was interesting to think that was the first time that had been such a familiar thing, dee da da dee da 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 dee, sung in French in the same spot. A liturgical evocation of our ancestor Christians who worshipped there, sung from a copy of the book that they would have used at the time. It's nice to have that sort of continuity and solidarity and a feeling with the worshippers of the past somehow. That's what that church looked like. There on the left, the fifth church on 27th Street. And there you have a wonderful photograph of it with what looks like a coal delivery cart there being drawn by a dray. Once again, rather a Gothic, crocketed pinnacle-looking building, which was then, I think, given to a German congregation for a brief period of time. That they bought it, but once again, long since demolished. And
it's interesting that it's using Gothic too. I mean, that became the trend, the new Gothic style, but it's also a form of Gothic that's not Anglican Gothic.
No, you can see this rather decorated thing here, and this almost ogee arch down at the bottom. Yeah. And yet the lancet windows, it's an interesting combination of styles.
It's an interesting combination of styles. And so the furniture we have in the church comes from that one, right?
I think the furniture, things like the
style.
top of the altar, the Gothic style business.
So even if we don't have the building, we have
a few bits
Gothic,
and pieces.
the Gothic feel. Right?
And it was for these churches that the brass plaques on the wall were made also. the commemorative monuments. We then moved into the Alliance Française for a brief period of time, just for about 4 years, here on East 60th Street, 22 East 60th Street. And this is what Dr. Maynard said about the sort of liturgies that could take place. As soon as the old church building was wrecked, we opened services as a new centre of work in the region of the French Institute, 20 East 60th Street. There's no doubt that it was the best location for our work in 1927, and that it is now, after an experience of 14 years, in more or less the same district. So he's writing this a little bit later on, as we'll discover in a minute. The congregation jumped immediately, although the facilities for our work were limited at the French Institute. There was only an auditorium which had no church atmosphere at all. The Sunday school had to meet in the basement next to the toilets. We developed very interesting work among the young folk. Our church attendance has never been higher than it was at the Institute. It's probably about, 60 people or something, 50 or 60 people, for looking at the church registers in the past. I must say, however, that a third part of the attendance was probably made up of Americans interested in the French language. Plus ça change. The feeling abroad was that we owned the French Institute, which was very flattering, but also embarrassing. I'm sure Madame Steckel would have a word or two to say about that. If she's still there, I'm not sure if she is. So here's the words of a children's hymn taken from a book dating from the time, a favourite of those who met in the basement next to the toilets. Convenient for the children, I presume. Ô toi, mon Dieu, je me donne tout entier. It's sort of fun, isn't it? Ton amour est ma couronne, ta force est mon bouclier. Oui. Je te donne mes journées, mes succès ou mes rêves. Mes revers, sorry. Je te donne mes années, mes printemps et mes hivers. Toutes les fleurs de ma route, viens les cueillir de ta main. Tous mes pleurs, goutte après goutte, les recueillir dans ton sein. It's rather nice. Dans la joie ou la souffrance, je veux te suivre en tout lieu. Toute ma vie à l'avance, je te la porte, ô mon Dieu. Sweet enough. Yeah, nice Sunday school idea. Yeah. Not sure what tune it was sung to, but we read it out. Not in the basement near the toilets, but at the entrance to the Alliance Française. Well, after we were there for a brief period of time, we moved yet again to 114 East 76th Street, which has since been bought by Lenox Hill Hospital, and the building demolished. But we were able to visit the actual building back 10 years ago or so to see where our congregation worshipped in an upstairs room. And here's a little photograph of the booklet that was used there in 1932, as you can see, 114 East 76th Street. It was printed by a Protestant printing house in Alençon. And here's Dr. Maynard again. We moved to 76th Street, where we rented a house for 3 years and altered it to make an oratory, seating about 80 people in pews, which were probably the pews that had been hauled from church to church, and about 30 or 40 people in chairs. So that's a good number of people, perhaps a little tiny bit bigger than we can seat just now. Mm-hmm. Our experience was that the location wasn't bad, but the outside of the house was too modest, and means of transportations were not very good, considering that many of our people came from Queens. We know that it's still rather tricky to get there on 76th Street on the east side if you're coming in from Queens. I've chosen the words of comfort from this little prayer book, intended to be read before communion. So that was the little prayer that I haven't included here, but it's the prayer of humble access. And there is the little bouquet of flowers that we left on the grill of that unoccupied building, as it was then. It had been bought by Lenox Hill, but not used. Then we moved to a sort of gingerbread Gothic church on East 61st Street. in 1934. And we stayed there until we moved here in 1941. And you can see here that this is a Christmas service for 1935. And you can see it's rather grand, actually. Communion service at 11 o'clock in the morning. We've got an organ prelude. We've got a Genevan Psalter. Here you can see that they're using the little booklet for Holy Communions, because it's got page 3, so that would be the equivalent of our bulletin. So we have a sung Kyrie here, and the Sunday school comes in and sings Salut blanche étoile, I presume. And then you've got the collect from page 54 in the Book of Common Prayer. The epistle, a gradual they're calling it, you see. So this is not, we're not being high church. This is an old tradition in the French church dating way back. We've got a gloire à toi before the gospel is read, and everybody is supposed to be standing. Rather interesting, isn't it, to see that we have an impression that maybe several 100 years ago, almost, it might have been a little bit more reformed. But we can see that actually the bulletin here for Christmas Day looks a little bit like what we do today at Saint-Esprit. So we've got more Moravian psalm here, and then the sermon by Dr. Maynard, and then the Sanctus, the Agneau de Dieu, and the distribution of Holy Communion. Gloire soit à Dieu is probably an organ piece played during the distribution of Holy Communion, and then you've got the blessing, set to Gregorian chant, interestingly enough. And you can see here, on the 22nd, 4 o'clock in the afternoon on Sunday, there's a ancient carol service, a bit like our Chant en Noël. And then on the 25th of December, which this year was a Wednesday, there's an 8 o'clock in the morning communion service. And you can see on the 26th, 27th and 28th of December, 3 Holy Communion services. And the 29th of December, another communion service at 8 o'clock, and then morning prayer at 10, and a preaching service at 11, and the children's service at 4. Poor Dr. Maynard must have been ready for a stiff whiskey and an early night. Joyeux Noël et bonne année. Ouais. Noël est la fête de l'espérance. And here we can see this little prayer is taken from the scrap of an Easter bulletin that I found from 1940, just before the German army invaded France on May the 10th of that same year. So this would have been their little Easter prayer. Chrétiens chantant en son honneur. Alléluia. Rather poignant, I think. And then, of course, we moved to Saint-Esprit. There's a picture of that church where those services were held. You can walk by it today, and it's a rather bland 1950s looking block of flats. But you can see it's a sort of gingerbread Gothic church that was demolished in the 40s. That's where the Cercle Henri IV did fencing practice in the basement, near the toilets. And here we are today. There's the end of our bike tour. As you can see on the right-hand side, we brought our bikes into church to sort of bless them. And there's an old picture of the front of the church on the left-hand side before the school did up this bit up here. But it does have our doors in there by the look of it.
And the grill. And
the grill behind the doors, yes, and an old-fashioned signpost, which we've now replaced with the commemorative plaque, and we've got the signpost, the sign on this side. But you can see they have the Episcopal and Huguenot flag flying from the flagpole, which still stands outside our church. It was here that the service was held for the relief of Paris, where Eleanor Roosevelt came and joined in with the service. I didn't have time to fish out that program or the little letter that Eleanor Roosevelt wrote to the rector of the time in thanks for the service for the relief of Paris. There are wonderful pictures of the jammed church, completely full with people on the stairs, people in the street outside the church as well, in perhaps one of the biggest liturgies that has been celebrated at the little French church of Saint-Esprit in this particular location. Perhaps we can rival it at the end of the pandemic. Now, that was a little trot through the ways in which our liturgical life has sort of shifted from place to place, and we can see some consistency in it, but we can also see some differences from period to period. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what's happened to our liturgies in the past 25 to 30 years. Some of this is going to be slightly embarrassing, I'll say. This is the service, the leaflet, of the very first service that I did at Saint-Esprit, typed up by Odile. You can probably see some familiar names on here. It's before you had to dial 212, perhaps. I'm not quite sure. Perhaps that's not the case at the top there. One of the first things I did was to remove this from the bulletin. Dear friends and parishioners, we respectfully request that you remember us in your wills and bequests. We will always remember you in our prayers. Not a very Huguenot sentiment, that one. But you can see some of these things are not in fact true anymore. You don't have to be an Episcopalian. You do have to provide us with a baptismal certificate, and you do have to have contributed within the last year. But some of these names will be familiar to you. Courtney Haff is still with us, as is Donald Redfern, but Fifi has died, and Julia's died, and Dudley has died. I think Betsy's still around. Sarah Johnson has moved to Paris. She's still in touch with us, and Sink Armstrong has died. Here's the inside of the bulletin. As you can see, it was a Holy Communion service for the first Sunday in October before we started the Oktoberfest. And you can see perhaps there's not that much difference between what we do for Holy Communion services now and what we did then, apart from the fact that people didn't sing quite as much. There was a hymn here, but between the first and second readings, we had Cynthia Wuko singing a solo instead of reciting the psalm for the day. Here we've got all the hymns were on separate sheets. As you can see, this was my first sermon at Saint-Esprit after being accepting the call to come here.
There's a misspelling of your name.
Yes, Odile had quite not got the hang of how my name was spelt at this point. No, I'm not blaming her in the slightest. And then here we've got Cynthia Wuko singing "Qui sont beaux, da da di da da da." I think that's how it goes. And then here we go at the bottom here. We're singing Jésus, rappelle-moi after communion, which we sang for quite some time. And then le pasteur gives the benediction, not called le recteur, encore moins le prêtre, ou le célébrant. And then the rêve Auguste Pluviose et la congrégation souhaitent la bienvenue au rêve Nuit Guilmassé, qui assume dès aujourd'hui son ministère permanent à l'église du Saint-Esprit. Little réception plus festive que celle des autres dimanches et plus nourrissante. Voilà. That's become a tradition at Saint-Esprit. We'll discuss how that works in a little bit minute. You can see some of the names here will be familiar. Erta and Diallo Ibrahima. Here is a copy of my first, well, no, it's not my first, but it's a Prière du Matin. Very traditional. You can see that I was still having trouble with numbers, so I had to write them out in French. I told you it would be embarrassing. And I would jot down on the bulletin topics for prayer, like Ibrahim, notre sacristan, qui partira demain à Baltimore pour chercher du travail. And then Helen Bowen, who was a painter, membre de notre église, ceux qui ont perdu leur maison et leur moyen de gagner la vie. I can see my clumsy, embarrassing French. Suite à les inondations en Floride.
Oh.
So you can see hurricane season. 143 here. Bienvenue dans notre église. D'autant plus si c'est première fois que vous êtes venu.
I think that's very, very cute.
I included it to give you a little comfort, Joris.
I feel like this when I do announcements in English.
Oh dear. So you can see we'll talk about this when it comes to language in the liturgy next week or in a week or two's time. So you can see that this is a very traditional morning prayer that happened 3 times a month on Sundays. Communion was only once a month on the first Sunday of the month. And I thought, when I'd been here for a little while, that perhaps if people wanted morning prayer 3 times a month, they were going to have to sit through a decent Protestant sermon that would last a good 20 minutes. And soon I had requests from the congregation for more communions because the sermons were shorter. Here is what we tried to do with our morning prayer service, to make a hybrid service between what we might have considered to be more of a French Protestant service and a Anglican service. So here you can see we have the opening invocation, but the summary of the law includes this thing that we still sing occasionally in morning prayers, and this is taken directly, set to music. I chose a tune for it, but this is the rite of penance from a French Reformed book of prayers, Seigneur que ta voix efficace, which we still use today. So I tried to sort of fix up morning prayer a little bit because I realized that what we were doing really at Saint-Esprit, when I first arrived, it felt quite low church in a way. Not that that's a bad thing, and it's very much part of our history, but it was done in a rather thoughtless way, perhaps, and I thought we needed to make a bit more of an effort with morning prayer to satisfy those people. I didn't know who was going to come, liturgically speaking, to the church once a new rector had turned up. I wasn't at all sure that there were a lot of French-speaking Anglicans out there who were going to come. I was aware that the French Reformed Church in New York City was going through some difficult times, and we had some refugees from that particular tradition down on 16th Street, I believe. So I wanted to make a service that they would recognize and feel comfortable with liturgically. Just as those very earliest refugees who came to Saint-Esprit wanted to sing the hymns that they were familiar with from their own home countries. So I tried to choose hymns that would reflect that and form a sort of hybrid liturgy that would give some of the best of the Reformed tradition and something of the best of the Anglican tradition with it too. So that's why we got this hybrid service of morning prayer. And then I would do that once a month instead of communion just once a month. And in keeping with actually what many denominations are doing today, at least before the pandemic.
Most mainline Protestant denomination only have one communion a month.
One communion a month?
Yeah. Like UCC, it's really common to have one.
Oh, just once a month?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
At Harvard Mem Church, it's once a month.
Once a month.
Yeah.
I swapped it round and did morning prayer once a month. And then occasionally, instead of morning prayer, to do a Thésée service. I also realised that as time was going on, and we'll see this in a minute, our special liturgies for special events like Oktoberfest, Bastille Day, Afrikfest, La Chandeleur, Huguenot Sunday. They take a lot of preparation and a lot of effort. And in terms of constructing a good liturgy, making sure that everything works well and it doesn't look self-conscious or forced, it looks like it's come very naturally. So a service of Thèse that contains silence and chant, meditation, varies the diet a little bit. So what I tried to do was form an annual calendar that was very predictable, liturgically speaking, and put in a quieter morning prayer or a Thèse service after a particularly busy liturgical season in the church. So there's not one standard liturgy, one size fits all, but it's almost like breathing, that there are times when you're panting and running, and times when you have to sit still for a minute and digest liturgically what's been going on. So here you can see a Thèse service at the top there, and the visit of Brother Bernard at the bottom here at a Thèse service at Saint-Esprit about 7 years ago, I suppose that must have been, maybe. I also noticed when I came, all we had in terms of the hymnal was the book on the left here, Nos cartes Chant. And I thought, if it's the last thing I do, I'm going to get this church to sing. We've got an excellent organist and a wonderful, talented soloist in Cynthia. Great resources to build on. So I thought to add to our liturgy, to get everybody singing together like they did in those earliest churches of beloved hymns that everybody could learn and knew the tune of, that brought people together under one liturgical experience. Having some good hymns was going to do the trick. So as you can see there, the Recueil à l'usage des églises de la Fédération protestante de France, we chose several hymns from that book. We still sing them. There are some really excellent hymns in there. But on the right-hand side there, you can see the binders that we pull our translations from, our new hymnal materials from, and try and keep as up-to-date as possible. But we'll talk about the importance of music in liturgy and the role of music in liturgy in a little bit more detail on another occasion. But I knew that that was important to get those liturgies really moving, to have tunes and words that that were beautiful, poetical, moving, that people could sing together and look forward to. I also knew that the church needed beautifying, essentially, and Etienne turned up at exactly the right moment to get this to happen. When we looked at liturgy and space, how you occupy the space and what beautiful things that you give to God and offer in Eucharistic sacrifice to God, I thought that it was important that we redo the crests that were looking shabby and repaint the walls of the church, choose a colour scheme that would be harmonious, get some new Eucharistic vessels here on the left, that was sometimes given, in this particular case, in memory of somebody like Sheila Saunders, that we could use to remember those people in our liturgies too, to make it personal, not just something that the minister did at the front, but something where every object, everything that is in the church, the beautiful icons of Nita, you can see one in the back there, that these things make the space not just beautiful, but also personal, where the liturgy isn't just a series of mechanical bits and pieces that you join together, but pieces that have a story, that carry a history. When I use the old Eucharistic plate and chalice today, it's all scratched up, it needs resilvering. But when I think of the people who've drunk from that chalice and eaten from that plate that has been there since my arrival and from before, Many of those people who are feasting now in glory have feasted from those same plates. And using them, it imbues those objects, as we have seen actually in our liturgical study, with a meaning that is not just functional, a sacrificial meaning, a meaning of remembrance that isn't just the remembrance of Christ and Christ's sacrifice, but our solidarity with that sacrifice and our participation in it also. So making a beautiful space filled with meaning and memory, as we can see, has been an important part of the way the liturgy at Saint-Esprit has unfolded.
I'm wondering, when you arrived, what about the flowers?
The flowers were done by a local, a florist that has long since closed down, unsurprisingly, on 69th Street. Julie Dewar, who was a member of the vestry, gave them a set of keys, and they would use any old flowers that were left over at the end of the week that had been sort of cut from, their big contracts in hotels and receptions and weddings and what have you. And they would bring a bucket of water and a key, come into the church, bodge a few flowers in the two vases at the front of the church, and then leave. They looked so sad and so wretched and so heteroclite. They looked like they'd been sort of pulled together from some compost remains. And it cost us $30 a week, and that was nearly 30 years ago. And I thought, we can do better than that. People love to get involved in the flowers to beautify the space. And that's become an important part, as we'll see in a little minute, of the way in which the space is owned, actually, and loved. So we repainted and we did and that project is still going on. And as you can see, the flower arrangements that we have now reflect the joy and the celebrations of the services that we have and the new services that we've introduced. You would be able to tell immediately which service you were celebrating if you wandered into the church here and saw the flower arrangements. We talked about colour in liturgy, we talked about flowers, we talked about the beauty of the worship space. And here on the left we have obviously a Bastille Day arrangement, and on the right an Afrique Fête arrangement. Another way of saying our liturgies should celebrate who we are as people. It might be the same standard Holy Communion service, but you can make that personal to the community. And as the community evolves, as the new people come, as new interests are represented, you introduce new ways of celebrating the people who are present in the church so that they can bring their cultures and their offerings and their celebrations and share it in a liturgical space.
That's really interesting, because it's the challenge of inculturation that's at play there, and that's always a challenge for churches and the Episcopal Church too.
Yes, indeed.
In Europe.
It's also a way of representing the people in the space itself.
Yeah.
It's not just the people, that the whole space echoes something of that experience in terms of the colour, in terms of the movement.
These two bouquets are really beautiful because they're both, and they have very different colors. You know which one is from Bastille and the other one for Afrique Fête, but they have the same spirit of joy in them that you can see.
Yes, I think that's so important.
They're both different and similar in a lot of.
Yes, I see what you mean. Yeah. It says our experience is all offered there. Yeah. And that though we might have come from different places and look different and maybe even speak different languages or have different understandings, when we come together there in church, we're all children of the same God. Yeah. And I think that's one of the subliminal ways in which liturgy works on us. Yeah. It doesn't have to be mea culpa, we're this, that, or the other. It all has to be wordy and confessional and exposing and stamping out racism, stamping out this, stamping out that, conforming to some sort of picture. It can be a glorious celebration that can be reflected in other ways.
It's the language of flowers.
The language of flowers, yes. One of my favourites. I also introduced some services that really probably hadn't been much celebrated for a long time. And here you can see the Garden of Repose from Maunday Thursday, this last Maunday Thursday, with Nita's icon there and the flowers and the chalice that I was just talking about that so many in the past have drunk from. I introduced a Christmas Eve service, a Christmas Day service. As you can see, Maynard was doing plenty of that in the past, and why it stopped, I'm not really very sure. But those services sort of dried up.
What seems to me is that to really build to have this liturgical life in a congregation, it takes time.
It does take time.
So when it's lost because of, sometimes you have different rectors or different ministers who just stay a couple of months or years, the life of the community dissolves a little bit.
It does.
Yeah, it's like a building, I guess. If you don't live in it, if you don't warm it, it just, gets scratchy and collapse in the end.
I think that's a beautiful way of putting it. And people have to get used to that routine and become to expect it.
Yeah.
And that takes a very long time to get back going again. But it can be lost so very quickly, sadly. But the pandemic hasn't lost it for us, I don't think, as we'll see in a minute. So as you can see, here's a little picture of introducing the children doing the creche and a nice packed church. Getting people involved in the liturgy of all ages is so important, I think. Setting up the figures, lighting the Advent candle, getting people involved in the Christmas Day service, getting people involved in the Easter service and the hunts and all of the rest. And we'll see other ways in which people become engaged too. Introducing the Christmas Eve service there's Marjorie at the front. Having people holding candles in the service to feel a part of the light of the world there. And each one playing that part, holding that light, producing wonderful memories that will be woven into the next time that we do this, because we've seen this picture and remembered Marjorie in that place too, who will be present with us through a liturgy that we remember her taking part in with such love. So the liturgy has this communitarian dimension that is not manufactured out of a one-off. No. It's something that's woven into the life of the people and becomes pregnant with meaning and ramifications and resonances that go far beyond the written bulletin.
Yeah, I think that's the difficulty when you have also people writing liturgies. I'm going to write a liturgy for that occasion, for this occasion, because we want to talk about, I don't know, ecology or any other topic like that. And starting the liturgy from this place of ideology is very different from the reality of it when everybody gets involved and it's actually the work of all the people.
Yes.
The other way around, when you start from an idea, is not making it very much the way of the people and not their whole selves.
I think both have a role to play, but very different role to play. I think for a convention or for, say, the Relief of Paris, they must have written a special liturgy for that.
Yeah, I see.
Or for the 300th anniversary of the revocation of the Edict of Nantes.
A bit like this poem that we read, which was a poem de circonstance, really meant for this special service of the promulgation de l'Edit Nantes.
But nothing can replace what you're seeing in these pictures of the liturgical life becoming an integral part as a part of the body of Christ. A seamless, almost unconscious until you begin to look at it and realize just how nuanced and subtle it actually is. That takes, in some ways, more patience, longer time, harder work, perhaps, as we've seen, than a liturgy that one might prepare for a very specific purpose. The reason that those liturgies are powerful is that they draw on the energy that are produced by this underground.
Yes, what's very interesting liturgy is that usually these other liturgies that we're talking about, like for instance, a very special liturgy for the commemoration, the anniversary of the Edict of Nantes, is going to be also a liturgy that will attract people who are not members of the community. So it's going towards the public ceremony, yes, and less into like the daily practice of the liturgy. Yeah. So it can be a form of outreach too. Yes. But it's one of the many shapes of the liturgy. But it's not a sustainable form, no, as regular Sundays can be. Or that's what I find really touching about that, is that on this picture it looks really grounded, and
yes,
people think,
yes, it certainly was.
See what they're doing, yeah, and that's the power of traditions, really.
And you can see also. Here's the blessing of the prayer books, the new prayer books, getting people involved, so that everybody owns it in one way or another, is such a crucial part of what happens at the front of the church, and what happens in the body of the church as well. And that's something we're missing so much just at the moment. It feels like a part of our liturgical life has been amputated. It'll come back. It 100% will. But I think those things that we have taken for granted over so long, the pandemic has sort of exposed for us, so that we can come back to them with gratitude and more consciousness of what it is we're actually doing, perhaps. So when I came to the church, well, yes, the chorale, for instance. It's an old picture, but a wonderful one. You can recognise several people there on it. Here's David Jutt on the piano, I think, here, and the old organ that you can see stuffed up the corner. Here we have Makiko and Linnea here, and Gloria, Lorna, and... oh, I've forgotten her name just for the moment. Hope she's not watching. But having people involved in a chorale, and not just paying singers. We've got a wonderful paid music staff who really, really enjoy getting people involved in the music. There are plenty of places to go in New York City where you can hear a highly professional, paid, expensive choir. If you come to Saint-Esprit, that's not necessary. Somebody once said to me, people don't come to Saint-Esprit for the architecture. And I took it as a compliment, actually. And one of the things that every bishop who's ever come to our church says, we feel like we're going into a village church that reminds us of some of the happiest times of our ministry. People put on a show for us when we go to the big churches of the diocese. But when we come to Saint-Esprit, we hear a village choir. And there's something really, it makes us feel, especially for Chant on Noël, they've often said this, it makes us feel really at home, like we're participating in a community that loves what it does and feels it. So as small as the choir might have been in some years, I think that that's been an important way in which people have owned the liturgy for themselves. Other really basic things. When I first came to Saint-Esprit, for the first Christmas, I asked for people to come and help to clean the church, polish everything up, make it look special for the big day. And nobody came. Well, of course, they pay their cleaners. You couldn't really imagine some of the names that you saw on the back of that first bulletin turning up and getting on their knees and scrubbing the floor. And I thought, this church needs a little bit of love. And one of the ways in which it's going to get a little bit of love is for the members to come together and clean it and polish it and go behind the altar and climb up on ladders and see what the church looks like from different angles, so that when they come back there and sit in the pews and look around for those services, they can see what they've done. And they can say, this is mine too. I've been up there. I did that. I polished that. Look how nice it looks. And I can come here today in my nice clothes and sit down in this beautiful space that we've all created together and liturgically use that space for what it's for. It sounds really dumb and really simple, but it works. That's the way it works. That's what liturgy is supposed to be. An ownership of the space, a love for each other, a respect for each other, and a sense of glorious celebration when you do come together to say, this, we're now in liturgical time and liturgical space. It's taken some effort to get there, but I wish that moment would last forever. But you feel sometimes in a good liturgy, and that's not by accident. It's not just because the organ's loud or the person's read in a nice way. It's all of this, that's just the tip of a wonderful iceberg. And getting people into the church to do all of that and to come together, prepare the food. Yeah. Food and liturgy here with this, that was the very thing that the sheaf here, the bread that we used out as Joris and his family there, and once again Marjorie, wouldn't be a show without punch. Coming together and recognizing that the receptions afterwards are also part of what we're celebrating, and that there's a sort of seamless joy that goes from the moment of the liturgy in the church to the moment of the reception in the garden. To see all of this fraternity, sorority, celebration, even to the extent of what we're eating on the table and in front of the table and what we're eating out in the garden, forms a part of what we're doing. It becomes concrete and not abstract. Anything to say about that, Joyce?
No, I think it's yeah.
And of course, what's changed? Well, here we are, morning prayer, evening prayer probably, unless there was a thunderstorm. Joris doing evening prayer on the left-hand side, and I'm doing communion on the right-hand side around Oktoberfest. Well, you can see certain things in common. The same cup that we have drunk from, the flower arrangements that have become more important because they're visual things that remind us of the season and the beauty of the space. Even though we can't occupy the space physically, at least we can see things sort of breathing through the screen, even if that produces in us a sense of longing or yearning to get back to that place. It's a challenge to move from a liturgy of an occupied communal space to a liturgy that can sometimes seem like a liturgy of appearances, of simple, looks. And here we can see I think this must have been Palm Sunday.
Yeah, look at the palms in the back.
Was it?
No.
Or a midweek communion.
Yeah,
midweek communion at Palm Sunday. So you can see all of the things that used not to be visible, all of the hard work that went into producing a beautiful liturgical space has now gone into microphones and cameras and positioning, so that what people see when they participate in the liturgy is something that looks as effortless and normal and beautiful as it can for those who are participating in it through watching it, but can sometimes feel quite lonely and exposed and rather messy for those who are trying to do it. I don't know if that makes any sense.
When you're, yeah, it's really, I really like the picture before, because I think it's really showing also that, and especially with Fred's work with the computer, how he's really careful about that. It's a way of continuing with what we have at the moment. The care that you showed with the cleaning, with the tidying, and all of this, that the people were doing when they could come every Sunday, and it's this care is also provided by Fred for us. In this ministry, that's the one of the taking care of the screen, making sure the noise is good, is perfect. So there's this attention that's given here, that's very liturgical too.
Yes, I think that's right. They're rather different, but absolutely true.
He does it for us. Yeah.
He does. Yeah. You can see here on a Sunday it feels rather sparse, as you can see. That's our view, basically. And Fred up here trying to see how different it feels from what you can see up here and what you were seeing on the screen. I still don't know what to make of it. And perhaps it's still too early to be able to describe what that is.
The trash bag.
The trash bag, the wires, the camera, the all-staring eye, the jumble, the coats and everything else that we just... You know, if this was a proper Sunday, none of this would be there. None of it. Well, the camera would be there, and I would be there, and the organ and the pews and everything. But things wouldn't be shunted about and pushed about. It's almost as if the space is having to sacrifice itself for the pandemic in order for it to do something else that it's supposed to do just now.
Because the space also becomes, to a certain extent with the camera, what the camera is filming.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
So that's why it can be crammed in the back, because it's not on the camera. But there is still care. That's what I'm trying to say. Is that there is...
Yes.
There's care, but it's changed location slightly, or the lens has changed.
Yes,
because it cannot be embodied the same way, so it's embodied by technology.
Yes.
And having other choice.
Yeah, there is no other choice. And we've had a go at some other ways of doing it.
Yeah.
You know, here we are, looking a little shell-shocked, singing We Gather Together. But what is a liturgy when it can be played back? If necessary, 100, 200, 300 times. Yeah. Does it feel as spontaneous, or as a liturgy might feel when you're present there and don't think about it again in the same way, or don't look back on it? Is the liturgical experience changed by that?
I find it difficult. I was writing emails for Huguenot Sundays, and I find it difficult to say the service of Huguenot Sunday, the communion service, will be, you can watch it later.
Yes.
I had to say, you can watch a recording of the communion service later, which is very different.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
Yes. Anyway, that was the last slide there. I think there are other things that I didn't have time to talk about the contributions that people make, like making the palms for Palm Sunday, that are part of the liturgy too. This careful preparation, the polishing of the silver, the small gestures that make the liturgy what it is. As you can see, we have a new altar cloth on the altar there at the front, that was made by Odile's mother as part of a trousseau. And I sort of turned it into an altar cloth. If you look a little carefully, it was made in Alsace, we think probably in about 1919, 1920. So it's about 100 years old. And, you know, all of these little gestures and little pieces that bring the space together, and each part of it carries a story, and that carries on. We've got embroidery coming from Bettina, and one that Joris and I have designed and will be bringing out to celebrate, as a reminder of this particular period too. Perhaps we should have one with a camera on it.
Yes.
To remind us of the pandemic.
But it's really lovely, like all this article and how it's telling something about the care that was put into making this object, which is a very beautiful object, can be brought into the sanctuary, and it's not all about the intention. It's not all about like I'm doing that or we are doing that together. It can be things that are really carefully prepared, that come together, sometimes from very unexpected places.
Yes, yeah, that's true. They suddenly find a liturgical use. Yeah, nothing is lost.
No.
Well, I think that's all we have for Liturgy at Saint-Esprit for the moment. We'll be looking at liturgy and language and liturgy and music, and perhaps we'll have a final session looking back at all the topics that we've done, just to remind us of what we've come through, and see if there are any further questions or clarifications on the topics that we've covered, and if it's sort of fulfilled our expectations that we had way back in September when we kicked off with the series. Well, it's about 8:30, so I think we're probably about ready to wrap up. Do we want to say a prayer from... I'm not sure if we got anything appropriate. Let's flip back and see. It was all... there was that thing for... Shall we say that?
Yeah. Let's do that.
And then you could do a Bénissons le Seigneur.
Okay.
Let's pray this prayer. Béni soit le nom du Seigneur, qui nous délivre de la tombe, qui nous ouvre l'éternité. C'est lui le Fils de Dieu, lui le Sauveur du monde. Alléluia. Chrétiens, chantons en son honneur.
Alléluia.
Alléluia.